lots of understandable concern from McLaren fans after a difficult first test and a very difficult day one of the second test. But is it all really doom and gloom for my old team?
Thanks very much.
Thanks for the dog biscuits. See you later. It's definitely not the best start to a season, obviously. With modern Formula One, unlike the old days where, particularly even in my day at McLaren, where we used to test almost endlessly. I think there was a period where we were doing something like 1,000 kilometres a week, around the mid-2000s. That's insane. That's an insane amount of track testing. And all the teams used to do it. It was open, there were very few restrictions on when and where you could test, and therefore we used to test as much as we could. We had plenty of money. That was never really a restriction in the tobacco sponsorship era. And so we'd be pounding around day after day with test drivers, with a completely separate test team, trying all sorts of new parts, running all sorts of new setups. And the amount of data we collected back then was incredible. In modern Formula One, though, we are limited to just 8 days of track testing before the season starts in Barcelona. That's 4 days with each driver. The regulations mean that teams can only run with one car at the test, and that hugely limits the amount of time and therefore the amount of data you can collect. Now, when the first of those 4-day tests is ruined at least partly by weather, in fact largely by weather, not just the snow but the very cold temperatures we had, and then the other part of that first test that wasn't necessarily disastrous with the weather, your car's not running through reliability issues, then that compromises you undoubtedly in a fairly substantial way. McLaren have essentially had to write off that first 4-day test in Barcelona, partly through weather, partly through the unreliability of their car. They had issues, if you remember, they had a wheel come off on the very first day, and other small issues that just cost them time. An exhaust bracket broke, which meant that they had to spend an awful lot of time in the garage making some sort of temporary repair. Those things are really, really painful to go through as a team because they're small, niggly issues, yet they cost you some of that really valuable track time. So when we get to the second test, the second and final 4 days, and McLaren have a disastrous day like they had yesterday through various problems, the first of which turns out was a battery problem from Renault. That stopped them twice on track. It also stopped the same battery problem from Renault, stopped the Red Bull of Max Verstappen in the afternoon. Renault have said that that's a batch issue with a certain batch of their components in the battery, which is worrying to some extent. They've played it down, of course. Wilson, what are you doing? Oh man. That's got to be cold. Renault have, of course, played down the issue. Oh, don't do that, mate. Always rolls around when he gets out of the water. Come on. Renault have played down the issue, of course, but it's got to be a worry that they're finding elements within a batch of their battery products that are failing so after such a short amount of mileage. It's all very well saying in your press releases that yes, this is testing, this is what testing's for. We look to try and find these problems before we go racing, and that is all absolutely true. Of course it is. You don't want to be finding these problems when you get to the first race, and there's an argument to say that if you have no problems throughout pre-season testing, it could be that the first time you find them is when you get to Australia, and you definitely don't want that either. However, this is your one and only chance to collect that data, to learn about your car, and if you fail, if you have problems this early and this many problems, you're just rapidly running out of time to recover. So just why are McLaren having so many problems? Well, a large part of it surely comes from this new relationship that they've got with Renault. They were so used to the Honda power unit, of course, they knew exactly how that fitted into the car. They knew exactly what Honda, the requirements of the Honda were in terms of its installation, marrying it up with the chassis. And when you've got a brand new power unit, it definitely takes time to get used to that, to get that understanding of exactly what's required from a new manufacturer. And these are teething problems that many of these teams would have had, at least some of, back in 2014, when of course these brand new hybrid power units were first introduced. One thing I've got to say is that, you know, you've got to feel sorry for the team. I mean, I feel sorry for McLaren fans, but the guys and girls in the garage, when you're having issues like this, and right now the team are in the midst of another power unit change because Fernando Alonso's unit sprung a leak this morning on the track. That just translates into more and more work for the team in the garage. By the end of last year, of course, by the end of that Honda relationship, they could take that power unit in and out with their eyes closed. This is a brand new system, a brand new unit. It takes a bit longer. There's probably 3 hours work in getting that thing out and a new one in, ready to start running again this afternoon. More time when the car's not on track. Whenever you have a new relationship, it takes time for the two halves to marry together. It's the same with the chassis and the power unit. You need to find the intricacies that they both have and find ways to match them both up. And the two won't necessarily perfectly match in the beginning. It's not just about fitting it into the package, it's about understanding how it needs to work, what its cooling requirements are, you know, what kind of level of flexibility there are in certain parts, certain hoses. I mean, all of these kinds of things which seem like tiny details, and they are tiny details, but genuinely can matter. And if over a period of 30 laps in a testing situation you start to rub through a hose because it's rubbing on bodywork, for example, and you spring a leak, those are the kind of things that you can't really test on a dyno, because that vibration and that rubbing probably only ever happens when the car's on a track. So it's perfectly natural that this will be the first time they find those out. The frustrating thing is, of course, that they're losing this incredibly valuable track time. The good news, of course, is that if it is just those kind of things, they are pretty easy to fix. It'll happen once, you should be able to fix it, it'll never happen again. The problem is, they're running out of time. We've just seen Daniel Ricciardo this morning set a new lap record around that track in Barcelona. That's using exactly the same power unit that McLaren have got in the back of theirs. And we always said that this was going to be a season when McLaren were going to be measured, directly measured and compared against Red Bull, given that they both run the Renault unit. Well, that's happening already, and at the moment it's a completely one-sided fight. The important thing is that none of these problems seemingly are too serious, and the team will get on top of them. They are professionals at doing this kind of thing. They will get on top of them. They're teething issues. We've seen the Red Bull go incredibly quickly. We've seen that team winning races with this power unit. McLaren will be back to their best. I expect them to challenge for podiums, potentially the occasional race win, who knows. But it's going to be a difficult and probably a slow start to the season, which I know is not what McLaren fans want to hear. The important thing though is I think there's light at the end of the tunnel for this long and difficult and pretty miserable McLaren journey that they've been on for the last few years. If you're expecting and hoping for an immediate challenge for the title as a McLaren fan, the sad truth is you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed.